perfect.
Well, good afternoon, listeners. You're listening to Lament of Hope podcast, and I'm your host, Danielle Richardson. And I am very blessed and excited to have Vicki Tiede here. And I came across her about a year ago. We were just talking about this before we started, but because of life events at the time, it didn't align to do the podcast. But now, a year later, we've been able to find a date to do it. And the reason why I wanted her on the show is because she counsels and mentors and helps women, mostly women anyway, who have experienced betrayal from a spouse or significant other due to a sexual sin. So, whether that's going to be like pornography or an affair or even same sex attraction, something like that, just any sort of betrayal that involves something sexual. And right now, she was just telling me she has about 20 to 28 women that she counsels regularly per week on this. And then her husband, Mike, who did experience a sexual sin in the past, is really able to encourage and walk with men or women, mostly men, who have betrayed someone that they love. And so with all that's been going on in the news about OnlyFans accounts, a lot of social media, and kind of this discussion about is pornography or is sexual sin okay, if the spouse is okay with it, or if the person is mentally struggling and this is a way they can relax, or just this discussion that's been going back and forth, which to be honest is very hard for me because, I've kind of been on the end of that for a lot of relationships in my life, and it does not have a positive impact whatsoever. But because this discussion is out there, I really thought it was worth the time to talk to someone who not only had experienced it in her first marriage, but also experienced it in her second. And they're very two different outcomes. And I think it's very important to talk about and have this discussion and just try to understand why this is negative, and also to give hope to people who are hurting and maybe people who are struggling with something and they want help but haven't gotten there yet. So, Vicki, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me, Danielle.
And I'm sorry, please go ahead and, I forgot to say, I believe it's liferenovationcc.com, right? That's your website.
Our website. Yeah.
So, Vicki, just to start out, who's someone who might be listening to this and this is sensitive for them and they're afraid to listen to your story, because they're afraid their story is not going to turn out well.
hmm
What's something you can encourage them in, kind of just to encourage them that this is a safe space, something that they can listen to, and have some hope that it's not all so dismal right now?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I would say if you're feeling that anxiousness, first of all, just take a deep breath and exhale it very slowly and rest in this space because we can invite the Holy Spirit into this space and say, hey, you're not here alone. And I think often when you hear other people's stories, it's validating. It helps you realize I'm not the only one. And in fact, with the numbers of those who look at pornography and who are acting out with problematic, unwanted sexual behavior, those numbers are extraordinary. And that means there are a lot of women and men. But today we're going to talk mostly about women being the betrayed partner, because that is more so the norm. But you're not the only one. You're not alone. And I think you'll find pieces of your story throughout the conversation we're going to have today.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Vicky, why don't you go ahead then and just start with talk about your first marriage, which was, from what you've told me, was really hard and heartbreaking. I don't know how you went through that. I really don't.
So I was married early, out of college, just a couple of years out of college. I got married, and almost right away, I knew something wasn't right. Like there was just this gut instinct, like this isn't how it's supposed to be. Like my husband really, well, I will put it this way: we went on our honeymoon, and he arranged to have a man meet us on our honeymoon, and that I know I'm seeing your face, Danielle. The listeners can't see your face right now, but say what? I mean, that was a huge red flag, and there was just an incredible lack of intimacy. And I thought, wow, we've waited to share sexual intimacy until we're married, and it's not happening. And I thought, what is wrong with me? What is going on here? Like, this just isn't how I thought this was supposed to be. And after our honeymoon, that just really continued. A lack of interest in sexual intimacy, a shift in behavior that I didn't understand. And I really just blamed myself. And then as time went on, there were more things. I found magazines, I found, you know, other things that he was keeping that pointed toward his sexual addiction. Um, I started going to bed alone more nights than not and waking up in the middle of the night to find an office door locked and him in on the
Yeah.
computer. You know, and I
Mm.
didn't know. I didn't know what he was doing. I didn't know what he was looking at. And I was young and I just wanted to believe him. And so I believed the stories that he told me. And then when your gut is telling you one thing and this person who you love and you've just made a covenant to honor and cherish and, you know, love is telling you something different, it's so conflicting. So I started to feel like I was a little bit crazy. Like, what is going on? And then he would flip it and he would blame me. You know, well, if you were more this, or you were more that, or you were thinner, or you were not so
Oh.
nagging, then I would want to be with you. And it was just so destructive. And then eventually, I uncovered, now this is almost 30 years ago, remind you. So people are like, what? Because technology was very different. The internet was fairly new. And he was downloading images from the computer and printing them. And he had a filing cabinet full of them. And then I discovered there was a secret post office box where he was exchanging videos, literally VHS videos with men. And as it turned out, my first husband was at at least same-sex attracted. I can't say that he um, was homosexual. I can't say that for certain. That's his story to tell. But he was acting out with men and he took trips with men while we were married. And it became a very emotionally and sexually and verbally abusive situation.
Mm.
And we did have one child, kind of miraculously, because we were sexually intimate so rarely, like literally a handful of times in the 3.5 years we were married. So eventually, I mean, there were no resources then. There wasn't betrayal trauma therapists. I went to a Christian counselor within months of being married, and I was told that I was codependent, I was co-addicted. But that was the model of care back then. When these things happened, there wasn't an understanding of betrayal trauma. So my therapist did the best they could with what they had, and I was doing the best I could with what I had, but it really wasn't enough. And eventually we got to the point where it was emotionally and physically unsafe for me to stay in that marriage. So, especially when he was acting out with men, I went through HIV testing and, you know, did STI testing for a long time. That was a very terrifying time, but I divorced with a 3-month-old in tow. And that is not, I mean, as a Christian, as a young woman who had dreams and ideals about what marriage was going to look like, I had dreamt
Mm.
of having this, you know, my parents are still married. They've been married over 60 years. And that's what I thought my story was going to be. So that was an incredibly devastating time with very few, limited resources available. So,
Did you, before while you were dating, like, did you have any whiff of this or just anything?
good question. You know, it's one of those things where hindsight is 2020. Like I can see now and go, "Oh, well that's why he, you know, like when I'd had boyfriends before and I had had a couple of boyfriends prior to him, I mean, there was some, you know, there was hand holding and there was, you know, kissing and there were some things. And he just really didn't desire for any of that. And
Hmm,
I interpreted that and he explained that as he was such a quote good Christian
I see.
that he was, you know, just trying to be safe. And that made me feel like I must be a bad Christian for I was like, what does that mean? If I want to kiss my fiance, does that make me bad? And that's not accurate at all. But those are some of the stories, the narratives that I started to adopt. Um, Now I understand. Like in hindsight, I can understand what that was about. And yeah, but I just didn't know. And there were at that point there were no books, there were no resources available. Within a couple of years, a couple of books, Affair of the Mind came out, and Barbara Steffen's book came out a, a couple of years later. But that wasn't available. You know, there weren't books. I couldn't go to the library and find something that would talk about what I was experiencing.
What did you, what was that day like when you told him, hey, this is not getting better and I'm done. I'm gonna go. Because it's interesting, in my family, my mother had to make the decision to divorce.
Mhm.
And it hurt, like it was so hard for her. Like she, raised, not she wasn't raised in a Christian home, but she'd been Christian for a while, and it came to this point, and I believe and that she did this biblically, but she had to do it, and it was she did not she carried so much guilt of having to be the party that had to say, I'm done with this. Because you feel like you're giving up, you feel like you're not doing that God is mad at you because you're breaking the golden rule. One
Yeah.
thing I will say for my audience, and I'd encourage you to listen to, one interview I did with Nagme was her name, and she told me she was talking about sexual abuse in her own marriage and having to walk through that. And she said that, Christians really idolize the institution of marriage so much
Mhm.
that there's such a fear that when that institution is crumbling, that you have to keep it together no matter what's happening because the institution is more important than the person.
Yeah.
And that is what my mom faced in the church. That's what she faced for so many things. And so I wanted to ask for you, like, what was that like when you're like, okay, here I am, you're still in your 20s, so
Yeah.
young, you have a baby, and he's not you're thinking the baby's not going to have a dad anymore, right? I mean, how did you tell him? How did you come to this decision? I'm going to do this in faith because I have to. There isn't an option anymore.
That's such a good question. You know, I to this day remember where I was sitting. We had actually were living in the South, and my family was in the North, and I had come home to have my daughter dedicated, and he chose not to come. So that was kind of the last straw, if you will, and all of it just kind of came together. So I'd made the decision, and I remember calling him. I can remember sitting in my dad's brown Naugahyde recliner. Like it's the details of that moment. You know how they're
Yeah.
defining moments in your life.
Yeah.
I remember the position I was in. I was in the kind of the fetal position, having that conversation. What what I remember most is that he didn't fight for me.
Hmm.
He didn't say, please don't do this. He didn't say, I'll do whatever I need to do to make this work. He never took ownership or responsibility of his addiction. He always made it about me. In fact, in the end, he turned around and said, I had postpartum depression. Nothing was further from the truth. Was I depressed? Yes. Was it postpartum? Yes. Did it have anything to do with this baby or my hormones? No. It was because of the abuse that I had incurred for the last 3.5 years. So that being said, he didn't fight. He There did end up being some long, complicated legal ramifications around visitation and things like that for our daughter, but he didn't fight for me or for the marriage, and that was information. And that's part of what I talk to partners about is you need to pay attention. There's content truth and there's behavior truth. It's am I checking boxes, and what is the checking boxes is content truth. I see a counselor, I am in a support group, I'm doing these things. But behavior truth, you're looking for something more. You're looking for meaningful. What's the heart? What's the intention behind this? And the fact that my first husband wasn't willing to take any responsibility, wasn't willing to own the damage he was doing to me and our relationship because of his sexual acting out, that's information. I can tell you it's taken almost 30 years for me to be able to say this, but I have some real empathy for him. I think
Mm.
he struggled. I know he experienced childhood abuse. Um, I know he experienced childhood sexual abuse and he didn't get care for that. I don't know that he told many people about that. And it had ramifications for him. And I think had he pursued the kind of emotional care that he needed, this might have had a different outcome. But he
Yeah.
chose not to do that. And you can't make somebody do something. You can only take care of yourself, your own regulation, your own decisions. And I couldn't force him to do something. And it makes me sad. Like I've grieved for the pain that he must have experienced his whole life.
Yeah. You know,
And
I I want to ask you a question for people listening. There have been several films that have come out probably in the past 10 years or so of either true stories or not of a man in a marriage who is married to a woman at first and then becomes attracted to a man. And the woman comes to a point, a lot of the times the film will depict where the woman comes to this point of like, okay, he needs to be his true self, right? So I'm like, kind of like what you said, I'm the problem. And he's figured out what he really wants and needs. And so I'm stepping out of this marriage, not for me necessarily, but so that he can live his best life.
yeah.
And uh, it's several times it's been portrayed as like great, positive, promoting something really good. And I want to ask you, you know, from your perspective, is that even realistic?
Oh, it's that is such a loaded, complicated question on so many fronts, Danielle. Oh my goodness.
Well, just from your experience, maybe
In my
that brings it down.
yeah, so let me say this. Could it happen? Yes. Have I heard of stories where that has happened? Yes. But those are few and far between. I think that the it's so much more complicated than that. And I actually kind of now, and I'll tell you the rest of our story, but I really specialize. One of my specialties is working with women whose husbands are same sex attracted, not that they have declared and identified as LGBTQ plus or any of those things. Not that that's not who I work with, but for those whose husbands struggle with some level of same sex attraction or same sex arousal, and those are different, right? Especially, and I'll just there's a whole spectrum. And if someone has experienced especially some childhood sexual experiences and their
Hmm.
body has been aroused by that and that is confusing to a young person and they create a narrative that can become a source of comfort for them, that when they or if they have experienced a lot of emotional abuse around their gender, around masculinity, and they don't feel like they are masculine, they may choose to look at, as adults, they may choose to look at same sex male porn in order to borrow, if you will, like borrow the strength that they're seeing in these men.
Hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's super complicated, but there's this spectrum, right? So I support the wives who are married in those situations, and hopefully those husbands are also getting care. My husband works with some men like that who struggle with that experience, and we have a few other people we refer to um, who also support that. So if they're fighting for their marriage, that is kind of a special niche that I have. So that being said, is it my experience that very often the wives are like, it's okay, we'll divorce and you go live your best life? And I don't see that so often. And quite honestly, I personally am not seeing those kinds of couples where he is then stepping out of the marriage and identifying as gay or anything else, right? Like that's just not who I'm working with. So it would be hard for me to say how often that actually happens.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. Yeah.
Yeah.
So then I'm
And
sorry, go ahead and keep
well,
going.
here's the thing, Danielle, you make a great point though. The media really wants to portray that isn't that the fairy tale ending if that's the story you want told. If you want to control the narrative, that it's all good in the end and that she's happy for him because he gets to live his best and true life. I I don't know. I'm That's a fairy tale. That doesn't reflect the trauma that has happened in that relationship and the trauma that perhaps has happened before.
Yeah. I know that's what I think. For me, it was so much like I don't mind if this movie was made, but can you show reality? Like pain,
Yeah.
suffering, connection that is now broken. I mean, those things are so deep and they're not very trivial. And so to make it so quickly like and for someone listening, it is not selfish to be mad and in pain at someone who's hurt you. Like
Right.
that's to be selfless and that is depicted as just letting the person do whatever and
Mhm.
being like, you know what, I'm gonna bear this. Being a martyr is not being selfless.
No,
Those are two very different things.
absolutely.
And I think for me, when I've seen or heard of these films, it's been hard because I'm like, they're making this like a selfless thing, but it's not. Like they're ignoring all of the pain. They're not having an honest discussion from the other person's perspective. Now, I get the person who's going, okay, this is what I feel. But what about the person who's being hurt? The person who's like, wow, this is going to change everything in my life, which is the honest truth. And
Yeah.
it's really important, I think, what you said that, that might happen, but I think there's two perspectives in that. I just haven't come across that, and that's really hard and sad to me.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, if I see that that is a theme, sometimes you don't know. You don't know what's coming in a movie. If that comes up as someone who has been in that situation, I'm probably going to turn that movie off.
Yeah.
I'm going to choose, there are things that I choose not to watch or see because I experienced sexual abuse in that marriage. And because one, even just, streaming TV um, is so provocative now and so, I mean, there's so much sexuality in it that sometimes you don't see things coming and you will see something and it can be highly triggering as someone who's experienced sexual abuse.
Hmm.
And so I just have to be very mindful and I protect my heart and my mind in that if I see something, I shut it off.
Yeah.
So
Well, tell me, so after you divorced, what happened? Did you live with your parents for a while? How did that?
we moved home to my parents just for a couple of months while I got a new teaching position and we moved. We experienced a lot of legal battles. Like I said, it took a couple of years to get that all resolved. Um, when my daughter was 2.5, I decided it was time for me to step out and see if I could date again. I did not look forward to that, but I was like, okay, here we go. I thought that was behind me. Um, at the end of the day, a friend set me up on a blind date, and that blind date did not work out. But that blind date set me up on a blind date with his friend, who he said, "You need to meet my friend because he would be a good match for you." And that turned out to be Mike. And so, I mean, I'm just so grateful for my old friend Bill who set me up with Mike. But Mike and I dated for a year and a half and then got married and added two little boys to the mix. Before we got married, I knew that Mike had struggled with some pornography issues. Um, and he knew my whole story. He was very, very aware. And actually he's a psychologist, so he was aware on a different level, right? Like he really understood the trauma that I had experienced. And so when I discovered that he also struggled with pornography, he was like, I'm done with that. Like that's not going to happen anymore. And it didn't for a while. And then we added two little boys to our family, and that's a season, for young marrieds. it's a very stressful time as you're adding children. Financially, things change. I was now staying home. We went from a double income to a single income, um, and more people to care for with less money. And so it was a stressful time.
Yeah.
And at that point, we had another D Day. D Day is what you call the discovery when you discover been another acting out. So we had a second D Day. And at that point, Mike knew I couldn't do this again. So he actually went and sought counseling, and he's worked with a just a general Christian counselor for about 6 months. It was my understanding that at that point, this was taken care of. And quite honestly, I was in my early 30s. I was exhausted. I had three little kids. I was working lots of little part-time jobs. I was like trying to tutor and do daycare for people and all these extra things to make a little extra money to help us out. And I think truly I was too tired to push and really ask a lot of questions.
Mhm.
So, unbeknownst to me, Mike continued to struggle. Um, and really, for 23 years of our marriage, he struggled. And I
Wow.
had no idea um, until one night I had another D Day. And that was just incredibly, incredibly painful.
Can I
Uh,
ask what it was or?
yeah, we were moving. We were moving to a new city to be closer to our daughter and her family. And it was the night before we were going to move, and he was up packing still, and I had dropped in bed. I was just exhausted, and from loading up everything, and um, I walked in on him, and he had been
Oh.
looking at pornography, and I walked in, and um, that was a really really traumatic thing. What made it even more traumatic was that we were leaving the next day. We left our home, we left all of our friends, we left our church, we
Hmm.
moved,
Yeah.
away, away. And so that was really, really painful. But by God's grace, in that interim, because during those years when I was raising kids and homeschooling, I ended up homeschooling our children. Before that third D Day, I got a master's degree in ministry, and I was speaking for women's retreats and conferences all over the country. And I wrote a book called When Your Husband is Addicted to Pornography, Healing Your Wounded Heart. Now, it was based on my experience of healing from my first marriage. Had nothing to do with my second marriage because I didn't know this was happening in my second marriage. So I wrote this book that was is written, it's a Bible study. So it's completely shrouded in scripture. I wrote the book. It came out in 2012. I ended up leading online support groups for wives for a few years, and met an incredible woman, Lachelle Burkett, who participated in my group. And then I invited her to co lead some of my online support groups with me. And then I was like, you know what? She's really good at this. And God called me to write this book, but He didn't call me to lead online support groups. And I personally believe anytime we do something that we think is a good idea, but He didn't put there, He is under no obligation to give us the strength and energy to do it. And doing those online support
True.
groups was sucking the life out of me. And so I handed that ministry over to Lachelle and said, take it, it's yours. The people will read my book, and then they'll go to the website and we'll send them to you for support groups. And bless her heart, she went on to become one of the first APSAT certified coaches. APSATs is the Association for Partners of Sexual Addicts Trauma Specialists. And she took that little fledgling support group ministry that I had, and she created a ministry called Hope Redefined that is truly one of the leading resources that I send people to now for support groups. Um, anybody can go there around the world, but she is based out of Tennessee, but everything's online. And so I was off the hook. I was like, yay, Lachelle has this ministry, and I'm just going to raise my family. And then fast forward to my discovery at year 23 of our marriage that this was a reality again. And so the first person I called was Lachelle. And what was beautiful is Lachelle was able to point us to resources, because in that 23-year span, so much more was available. In fact, even in 2012, when I wrote my book, there were only just a handful, maybe 5 or 6 books out on the subject of betrayal, and nothing on betrayal trauma that's even newer. And so now we know so much more about betrayal trauma that happens. It's different than PTSD, but it definitely is a trauma for the partner whose husband is struggling with a sexual addiction. And so I immediately started counseling. My husband immediately started counseling with very just incredibly equipped people. We did not go to just our local Christian therapist or Christian coach. We chose to get support from people who were trained in sexual addiction and recovery and betrayal trauma. And I think that was a critical piece. It's really something I recommend all women and men who are experiencing this, that they get the best. Go to AppSats partners. If you're looking for support, go to appsats.org and find somebody. Most of the work is done virtually, and men can get, or the betrayers, those who have the struggle, can find a CSAT, which is a certified sexual addiction therapist, or a CSASI coach, somebody who is trained in sexual addiction and can really support you in your recovery, has some specialized care and understands the trauma around it. So that's what we did. And I would say we are in full-time recovery now. This is going to be part of our story forever. You don't get to take this out. There isn't a finish line to this kind of recovery any more than there is for an alcoholic or someone who has had an addiction to narcotics or something else. They're always going to be an addict, but they can be having sobriety. And that's us. Mike has sobriety. He's had sobriety for well over 2 years. And I say that with caution, right? Because we're always one step away from a fall.
Yeah.
We have to, every single one of us could really mess up in any moment. Like, we're so many temptations, so many opportunities to make a misstep. So I don't say it flippantly, like I'm like, whoo, this will never happen to us again.
Yeah.
No, I pray it doesn't. And I see my husband doing the work and me doing the work. We've done the work. So I always say, when you get married, there's you and me, and the day you get married, there's an us. And that's a whole new entity that has been created. And when addiction rears its head, that us is ruptured. And so healing has to happen individually first before that us can be restored.
Mm.
And that's really what we help couples do now.
What is, for a woman who is listening to your story and is saying, you know, obviously you're more mature in years, and they're like, you're telling me that it's only been 2 years. Some people may not see that as a
Yeah,
big deal. Like, they're hoping for 10, 20 years of
yeah,
freedom. And I love what you said about the fact that, this is never, it doesn't have an end until, if you're a believer, heaven, right?
yeah.
There isn't
I
an end because there's always a trigger, there's always a sin struggle, there's always stressful times. Something else you mentioned with having children, obviously, too, is that there are lean periods in sex because you have kids and
yeah,
you're really busy, or also you just had kids and you can't have sex, right?
right.
So those are just all these things that just help encourage and promote a sin struggle and help with that. I wanted to ask you though, how would you encourage a woman who is, what's the word I'm looking for? Who says, well, I don't want that. Like, I want this to be done. I don't, I've been married to this person. I love this person, and they are working through it. They're working through it. I see it. but I want it to be done. Like I don't want to ever have this come up again. And if it does come up again, I'm gonna stop. I'm gonna finish
Oh,
and end this
yeah, yeah.
because I don't want to live my life always thinking this might happen.
Oh
And
no.
obviously that's something that I'm sure happens to you at times in the back of your mind when your husband's on the computer sometime or you're not home, whatever it is.
Yeah,
What would you encourage someone who is like, it's either all or nothing. I can't do it.
I know. Well, that idea of I just want it to be done. Yeah, me too. Me too, sister. Like, I can I just like I'm with you. And the reality is okay, so there was a study that came out in 2024 um that said 61% of men report porn use. 61%. 44% of women report porn use. This is the
Wow.
reality. So, like thinking that if you do this again, I'm out of here and I'm going to go find something better. Well, take it from me, two marriages, two men who struggle. The odds are not in my favor of finding someone who isn't also struggling. Let's figure this out. Let's learn some tools together that can be helpful. And there are incredible tools. Here's the deal. If if this is a reality in your marriage and you think you can work this out by yourself or you can pray it away and it'll go away, well, my sweet Mike prayed for probably 40 years of his life that this would go away and it didn't.
Yeah.
It took work. It's hard work. It's hard work. You can't just go and visit a therapist and check that box and say, I'm good. No, he or she is going to give you tools and resources, and you have to practice them. And practicing means it's not going to be perfect.
Yeah.
And we're not aiming at perfection. For someone to feel safe, they need their person to be reliable and consistent in their behavior at least 90% of the time. That's what we're helping couples get to. And that 10% of the time where they aren't reliable, how are they showing up when they've messed up and they've not been reliable? Are they defensive and ugly, or do they take responsibility and say, I did that. Oh my gosh, I did that. I'm so sorry. Here's what I'm doing to correct this. I think sometimes couples are just white knuckling it. And if you're white knuckling recovery, going, okay, I think I can, I think I can, I think I can, like that's not it. You need tools and resources. So work with professionals who can give you those tools and resources, who can practice them with you, who can help you really understand what sobriety looks like and how it can be maintained. There could be a slip. And you make such a sweet point. And even when I say Mike has had over 2 years of sobriety, and I go, yes. But the fact of the matter is, true recovery takes at least 3 to 5 years. And then I go, okay, maybe boast about that. Maybe I shouldn't boast about those 2 years. But I just heard about another friend whose husband went through all really excellent recovery resources and tools and had sobriety for 20 years and just had a relapse. It can happen. So 2 years, 20 years, does it really matter? The thing is are they doing the work every day? Do they have the community surrounding them that is supporting them? If somebody doesn't have that accountability and that community and those people that they can really be authentic about and assertive when they can say, I'm struggling. They need those people that they can say, I'm struggling.
Yeah.
That's something that I see in Mike's life. He has a group of safe men who are believers who they hold each other accountable. And it's not the attaboy, like, I'm struggling. Yeah, me too. It's not that, right? It's not that. That's not helpful. So I don't know if I answered your question, Danielle, in that have I encouraged that woman who just wants to be done? I see you. I get you. I understand that. And the reality is it's not going to be done. And if you want to just sweep it under and be over it, then it's going to definitely rear its ugly head again. Instead, go all in and do the work to actually have a healthy relationship because your marriage has lacked healthy sexuality. And I believe healthy sexuality is absolutely possible.
Yeah. I want to say, I think what you said about the 2 years with such excitement and a smile on your face is what Jesus would do because
Mm.
Jesus sees and God sees the progress of the sanctification and goes, yes, I
Yes.
see you. I'm so proud of you. But I think the human response is you failed, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's what you did is that makes me smile because I'm like, you know what? That's what God says. The
Mhm.
human says, I'm giving up. I'm giving up on you. This is done. And obviously, I want people listening to understand we're not talking about, as Vicky was talking about earlier, a husband who's unrepentant, will do nothing, will hurt you. This is not the same thing. So see the two differences here and understand that what we're talking about is yes, there are some times when you have to give up. That is the answer. That's a very painful, hard answer. But with her second marriage, what we're talking about now, seeing the beauty of you encouraging him. And I think this is where a lot of women that I have talked with, or even me personally with family in my life, it's like, how do you balance that, right? Because there are going to be times when the person's going to come to you or they're going to say, hey, I messed up. I'm really sorry. And you're going to be mad. You're going to be like, why did you do that, right?
Mm.
Especially if one thing I've been blessed with in my life is not to have had pornography, me personally, that I
Mhm.
have seen to give me, or I never experienced sexual abuse to give me that first for something like that.
Mhm.
So it is something that I am continually trying to understand because I don't really understand the attraction to it. I
Mhm.
can understand something like helping yourself feel better by doing something, a sexual act that would give you some sort of pleasure. Like, we were talking earlier about masturbation, and that is something that as a young person, I definitely struggled with because I was in very stressful situations and it really, really relieved that stress from me. And it was a sin. And it's something that still, years later, sometimes that voice comes in my head and says, there's no one here. You're really stressed.
Oh,
Yeah, no one's gonna get it. Um, and I'm so grateful for my counselor and the people the Lord's put in my life. But
yeah.
I, pornography is just something I still don't really understand. And I've had women talk to me and say they've struggled with it. And I'm like, how? And they're like, it's, but it is a huge thing. And I guess I'm sorry, when I went off track, but what my point was is that with a woman who's listening or a man who's listening, and they're like, well, how do I encourage my spouse while at the same time maintaining a balance of being honest that I'm angry at them? But
Yeah.
how do I go, okay, I need to help them. I can't, because I've had people I've talked to I've had a person who shared a story of withholding sex for their entire marriage because
Yeah.
they found out that they had done pornography, the spouse had done pornography, and they said, we're never having sex again. And they kept that promise. They've never had sex since then, and I think it's been a couple decades now. It's
Yeah.
incredible.
Yeah.
Wrong answer. But
Wrong answer.
very relatable answer, right?
Yeah.
Because you're like, why in the world do I want to do that? Right?
Right.
But then that isolates the other individual, right? It's like, okay, now you don't even want to help me out here. You want to punish me on top of the punishment that I feel upon myself.
And I understand it. And I understand that because that partner feels so incredibly unsafe, and opening their body up to be sexually intimate with someone who has betrayed the covenant of their relationship. I understand that. Um, it doesn't have to be 20 years. At any point, either one of them could have said, and maybe did. So I'm not judging this couple because I don't know their story, right? But at some point, you have to say, we have to get help. We
Yeah.
can't figure this out. This isn't working. This isn't what God intended. I mean, God created sexual intimacy. It is a beautiful thing. It's right off the bat in Genesis. It talks about it. Like it is a great and beautiful thing when handled biblically and in a beautiful way. And so it breaks my heart when that happens. And I work with spouses all the time. Sometimes it's because she has said no, and sometimes it's because he has said, I'm out. I can just take care of this myself. And then she's neglected. And so it's very complicated, but it doesn't have to be that way. In fact, for our clients, my husband and I are bringing in someone who specializes in this to talk about healthy sexuality after betrayal. And I'm so excited about this because it's possible. It is absolutely possible after there's been betrayal for there to be healthy sexuality. But you have to get help. And thinking you can figure this out yourself or just saying, well, then I'm never going to do this again. Now, if he's continuing in the pornography, I understand you setting that boundary, but it gets very, very complicated. So that's the one side. And on the other side is what do we do when he comes and says, I've had a slip? Like I've been walking in sobriety. Is that what you were asking before? Like, hey,
Yeah.
I've been doing really, really well and I'm doing all the things I'm supposed to, and I've had a slip. And it is reasonable. So the trauma brain, I always equate it to not aquarium, an accordion, an accordion that folds up on itself. So when a traumatic experience happens, like your original D-Day, when you have first discovered the pornography and all of the trauma that that brings with it, and now time has passed and he or she seems to be doing all the things that they need to be doing to stay sober and really working on their recovery. And now they come to you and they tell you there's been a slip or there's a relapse, which, by the way, lucky you if they tell you, because that's usually not how it goes down. Usually you have to discover it the hard way. You have
Mm.
to discover it yourself. Very rarely does it come with a confession. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So when you have that new discovery that this has happened, your brain is going to fold up, and it is as though the original trauma is happening again right now. And that is what betrayal trauma does. Your brain closes up. Physically, you're going to feel all the sensations all over again. And even if it was a small thing, even if it was um I was really tempted to masturbate. Okay, brain has closed. That's it. He may not have actually done anything. Or I was super tempted last night to turn this on. Or I turned on the TV and this TV show was on. I mean, just something, any old thing that you would see on television. And there was a sex scene and I stayed on too long. I didn't watch the whole thing, but like a couple of seconds went by and I didn't change the channel. And I'm telling you that. Okay. Again, that's a slip. And the fact that he's telling you was really good, but her brain is going to close. And it is though he may as well just have had another affair, right? Like that's the reality of this. This is going to stick around for a minute. It's going to take time. And the more reliable you are, the more you are consistent you are in your recovery and you're staying on track. And when you have that slip, I kind of mentioned this before too, like what are you doing in the 10% where there's been a hiccup? When, if you're reliably following your recovery protocol 90% of the time, and in this 10% window, you have a slip, when you come and confess it, one, do that. Tell her. Don't make her find out the hard way because then she's going to think you would have never told her. That just damages trust even more. But
Mm-hmm.
as soon as you tell her, what is your response going to be? Are you going to be defensive or are you going to acknowledge it? And are you going to validate her feelings and, reassure her that you are back on the beaten path and you're doing the hard work again, and you've called your coach or your therapist and you've reached out to your support group and you've upped the ante on your accountability software or your filtering software? Like, tell her, take responsibility for it.
Yeah. These are all so good, and I hope that people are listening are encouraged by this because it's such a hard topic. But it's something that the Christian church and so many Christians are experiencing, and it's not an otherworldly issue. It's a very core issue for being human and being sinful. And so it's very important to talk about this, So Vicky, the last thing I want to ask you, because I want to be respectful of your time, in the life you've lived, I would think that there are some aspects of God and attributes of God that have gone from head to heart for you because
Mm,
you've actually seen and experienced God in some very deep, hard things.
mhm.
And suffering is awful. It's not enjoyable. It's not something you wish over again, but it is the way that you get to know how much you're loved by God. And so I did want to ask you, is there an attribute of God that you know now way better than you did when you were 20?
You know, um, there's so many. There's so many. I mean, God's faithfulness is so stark for me. I mean, He has just been so faithful in my darkest pit. I always know I can take the next step and He's going to be there. He has not abandoned me. He pursues me. He chooses me, even when my husband didn't pursue me and choose me. And I think one of the things that I'm so grateful for, think about 2 Corinthians 5:17 that says, the old has gone and the new is here. And I think that's something that we forget that God can do. That is an attribute of God that we forget. Like He did the creation and He's finished, but He continues to create new, right? And that is God is a creator of good things and things that glorify Him, including relationships um, and our sexuality. Like He can take that old and put it as far as the east is from the west, and He can create something new. And that's what I think is so beautiful, that I just really want to encourage people. I think if you are a partner and your spouse has been acting out, or you suspect or don't feel like you have to do this alone, one, invite Christ into it, and two, know that there are people who stand ready to support you, that you don't have to do this by yourself. And there's just amazing hope in Christ.
Yeah. Well, Vicky, thank you so much. I'm so blessed. This was such a good conversation and it was encouraging to me. So I'm so hopeful that it will be encouraging for people listening as well.
Thank you. It was a blessing to get to be here.